Hello everyone. So in this video we'll be discussing about HTML forms. So you must have seen, you must have filled a form like this on a website ever in your life. So it asks you that your first name, last name, then it feeds data. So how you could create a form on your website and you could feed data in your database. We'll be discussing about this in this section. So this is going to be the first lecture of this section. And in this we'll be discussing, all the overview how HTML form works, etc. etc. So an HTML form is used to collect user input. The user input is most often sent to a server for processing. So if I press submit over here, so I find that submitted form data you received, your input was received as first name was John and last name was Doe. The server has processed your input and returned this answer. So this is how you could use HTML forms. Now we have to use some form elements also. So the first basic element is form element. So first you have to start it and then you have to use the end tag, and in between we'll be seeing what all different elements we have to use. So we have to use the input element. The HTML input element is the most used form element. So an input element can be displayed in many ways depending on the type of attribute. So now here are some examples, that if you have input type is equal to text, so now it will display a single line text input field. If you want an input type to a radio button, to a checkbox, or maybe a submit button, or maybe just a button, so different input could have different types. So now let us see for text fields. Now for example, what we need to do, first we need to write label. For example, if we need a result like this, that there should be first name and there should be last name, so how we could generate such a form? So for that we need to make a form. So first we'll use the form element, then we'll write label, then we have to mention the ID for first name, that is here we have written f name. So now first name will be displayed and label will be closed. So label here is first name, this is the label. Now input type is text and the ID is f name. So f name, for this here it will store, and the name is f name and it will break. So when we write input type is equal to text and ID is f name, so f name here is for the label, it will link to that. This input data will link to this label, and what will happen, the name is f name. So here it is used, and you would also label for last name similarly, and you could create a form like this. Now let us discuss about the label element. Notice the use of label element in the above example. The label tag defines a label for many form elements. The label element is useful for screen reader users because the screen reader will read out loud the label when the user focuses on the input element. The label element also helps users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions such as radio buttons, checkboxes, etc. etc. Because when the user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the radio button checkbox. So for label, sometimes it's like that you just don't have to click on the radio button, that circle which you fill or tick sometimes, in a form, in an MCQ test, something like that. So what you can do is you can also click on the text. So it is not label is helpful there, because you don't need to press in the radio button, and it might get difficult for some users. So if you, even if you click on the text, so it will select the radio button or the checkbox automatically. Now the for attribute of the label tag should be equal to the ID attribute of the input element to bind them together. So the for label, for the ID mentioned there and in the input should be same, so that it could be linked and both could be bind together. Now let us talk about the radio buttons. The input type radio contains defines a radio button. Radio buttons let a user select one of a limited answer of a limited choice. So for multiple elements you cannot use this. We'll be seeing how you could use that for multiple elements. Now choose your favorite web language, HTML, CSS or JavaScript. Now if I want to create such a form, so what we need to do, first we need to use the form element. Then I'll write input type is equal to radio, ID is HTML, name is fav language. So and value is HTML. So value here I have to mention. So I mentioned this input tag before because I want the radio button before the word. Before HTML, I wanted the radio button. That is why I wrote the input first. And then I want to write HTML. So I will write label for HTML, and then I'll write HTML or whatever I want to write over here. So similarly, we made it for CSS and JavaScript also. So this is how, a radio button works, and this is how a form works. Now I could only select one. If I'm selecting this, the check marked on HTML disappears and it appears on JavaScript. So this is how radio buttons work. Let us also see for checkboxes. The input type checkbox defines a checkbox. Now, if I want checkbox here, so first I have to use the input data for the checkbox. Let us see. Like I have to checkbox all the three things. So I could checkbox all the three things. Now, in this, what we have to do, we have to write form action page dot php. Some PHP language is also being used here. Let us ignore this. And in this, we'll write input type is equal to checkbox, because input what we want from user, it is in the form of checkbox, and the ID is vehicle1 and name is vehicle1 and value is bike, right? Now for this label for vehicle1, I have a bike, we'll write it over here, and similarly we'll create two more. I have a car, I have a boat, something like this. And I could, I have a bike and I could submit this. So here it will appear submitted form data. Your input was received as vehicle1, that was bike. So this is how you could use. And there's also a submit button also. If you have seen now, when we press submit, so how the submit buttons come. So input type is equal to submit defines a button for submitting the form data to a form handler. The form handler is typically a file on the server with a script for processing input data. The form handler is specified in the form's action attribute, right? Now talking about form action, the for label for this and this, and then you have to take the input, and then in the last line we have written input type is equal to submit, value is equal to submit. So what we need to do, if we press this submit button, so what happens is that something like this appears. So this submit button is also inputted by the user, so we have to put input type is equal to submit. Now comes the name attribute for input. So the name attribute could also be used. Notice that each input field must have a name attribute to be submitted. If the name attribute is omitted, the value of the field will not be sent at all. So we need this name also, like ID, F name, value John. So we need something like this to submit this. If you like try over here. So if you click on submit button, the form data will be sent to a page called this page. It will go over here. So where do we want to store this, all the form? So we'll write action is equal to this, but this is, in a PHP language. So PHP language is also used in web development, but in a very advanced version. So this is how it works. In the next lecture, I'll be discussing about the HTML form attributes. So, and I'll meet you in the next lecture. This lecture was just the overview of the forms.